Okay, so this week we're going to dive into something that, well, a lot of us think we've got figured out.
Mm-hmm.
The two greatest commandments.
Mm-hmm.
We've all heard them, right? Love God, love your neighbor.
Yeah.
But trust me, there's a surprising amount of depth to uncover here.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll be exploring the Bible, looking for insights, and seeing how these commandments can totally revolutionize how we understand God's love and how we live it out. Get ready for some aha moments.
I think what's fascinating is that these two commandments are really the foundation of our faith.
Right.
It's like they're holding up the entire weight of the Bible. Everything kind of goes back to these.
It's true. It all starts in Matthew chapter 22. And someone asks Jesus, like point blank, what's the greatest commandment?
Yeah.
And Jesus replies, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind.
It's not just a suggestion, right?
Yeah.
It's the core principle. It's the very essence of following Jesus.
Yeah. And then he goes on to say, the second greatest commandment is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And get this. He says that all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
It's wild.
Like it's huge.
Like a sturdy hanger holding up an entire wardrobe. You can't really understand the Bible without grasping this central truth.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
And here's what's really interesting to me, at least. These ideas aren't new. They're woven throughout the Old Testament, too.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy talks about loving God with all your heart, soul, and strength.
Right.
And Leviticus tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves.
So Jesus was really reaffirming a timeless principle.
Yeah.
A thread running throughout the entire Bible. It's the heart of God's character revealed from the very beginning.
It makes you realize how connected everything is.
Yeah.
But understanding is one thing, right?
Absolutely.
Putting these commandments into practice, well, that's where things get a little tricky.
For sure, for all of us. That's why the story of the rich young ruler is so insightful. In Matthew chapter 19, this guy comes to Jesus, and he wants to know what good deed he needs to do to inherit eternal life. Like he's focused on checking off a list. He even boasts that he's kept all the commandments since he was young, but Jesus sees right through it.
Yeah.
And challenges the man to sell all his possessions and follow him.
It's such a powerful moment.
Yeah.
It's like Jesus is asking what's truly most important to you.
Yeah. And sadly, the story ends with the young man walking away, unable to part with his wealth. It reveals a powerful truth about loving God wholeheartedly.
It requires sacrifice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Makes you think about what things we might be holding on to a little too tightly. Maybe even placing those things before God in our lives.
Absolutely. It really connects to this idea of the two greatest sins that directly oppose these two greatest commandments.
Okay.
Idolatry and injustice.
Okay, so idolatry, that's putting anything before God in our affections. Whether it's money, success, comfort, or even good deeds that we're doing out of pride.
Right. And on the other hand, there's injustice.
Okay.
Which is failing to love our neighbor, turning a blind eye to suffering, not reflecting God's love in tangible ways.
Yeah. The Old Testament prophets, they were really fierce about social injustice.
They were.
For example, there's a psalm that contrasts the enduring nature of God with the fleeting nature of idols.
It reminds us that anything we prioritize above God will eventually fail us. But God's love, that's eternal and unwavering.
It really is. And in another book, God actually speaks directly to those who ignore his call for justice. He describes them as having hearts as hard as stone. They've turned away from the needs of the oppressed, and they're facing God's anger.
What's often misunderstood is that God's anger towards injustice actually stems from his deep love for the vulnerable. He identifies with those who are suffering and longs for them to experience his justice and compassion.
It reframes our understanding of God's anger, doesn't it?
For sure.
It shows that love for God and love for others are inseparable, like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. It's spelled out clearly in the New Testament. If someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen?
Wow, that's powerful. It's a reminder that we need to examine our own hearts and actions. Are we truly loving God if we aren't reflecting that love in how we treat the people around us?
A great question.
Are we actively seeking justice for the vulnerable? These are the questions that come up when you really start to grasp the depth of these commandments.
Absolutely. It leads us to consider how Jesus exemplified these commandments in his own life.
Yeah.
Think about how Isaiah calls for people to actively seek justice and defend the vulnerable. Jesus did this constantly.
He did. He healed the sick, fed the hungry, reached out to the marginalized. And he wasn't afraid to confront the religious leaders who were prioritizing rituals over true justice and mercy.
Right. In one passage, Jesus condemns the Pharisees for neglecting both justice and the love of God. They were all about outward appearances, but missing the heart of the matter.
It shows that true faith has to be lived out, not just talked about.
For sure. And here's a powerful truth about Jesus' mission. He didn't just talk about justice.
Right.
He came to bring it. He was the embodiment of God's love in action.
Like when Jesus read from Isaiah and proclaimed that he was sent to preach good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, he was declaring that he was here to make things right.
Absolutely. And this connects to what we see in the Psalms. One says that God judges the world with righteousness and is a refuge for those who are oppressed. And another highlights how God provides food for the hungry, frees prisoners, and lifts up those who are down. God is working to bring about his will, to establish his kingdom of love and righteousness.
It's such a hopeful message. It reminds us that God is on the side of the vulnerable, the forgotten. He hasn't abandoned them to their suffering. He's actively working to redeem and restore, to bring true justice and healing. And he calls us to join him.
That's where the question, who is my neighbor, becomes so crucial.
Yes, because in another gospel, after Jesus teaches about loving God and loving your neighbor, someone asks him to define exactly who that neighbor is.
Right.
They're trying to limit their responsibility, to draw boundaries around their compassion. And that's when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan.
It's one of the most well-known stories in the Bible, and for good reason. It challenges our preconceived notions about who deserves our love and compassion.
It does. It's the story of a man who was beaten, robbed, and left for dead.
And those who should have helped him, a priest and a Levite, pass by on the other side. But the one who stops to help is a Samaritan, someone considered an outsider, even an enemy.
Yeah. And he shows radical compassion.
He does.
He bandages the man's wounds, takes him to an inn, pays for his care. He goes above and beyond.
And Jesus asks the question, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who was robbed? The expert is forced to admit, the one who showed him mercy. And then Jesus concludes with this powerful challenge, go and do likewise.
It forces us to expand our understanding of who our neighbor is, to include anyone in need, no matter who they are or what their background is. It's a reminder that God's love is limitless and ours should be too.
And that's just scratching the surface of these two greatest commandments. They challenge us to examine our hearts, align our actions with God's love, and become agents of change in the world.
It's about breaking down walls of prejudice and indifference and embracing the radical inclusivity of God's kingdom. It's about seeing every person we encounter as deserving of God's love and grace, and it's about letting that love flow through us in real, practical ways.
It's about realizing that when we love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving our neighbor as ourselves is the natural outcome. It's a heart transformed by God's grace.
It's about becoming more and more like Jesus, reflecting his love and compassion in everything we do. It's a journey for all of us.
You've captured it beautifully. And this is just the beginning. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dig even deeper into the practical side of loving God and loving our neighbor.
So we just explored how Jesus used that parable of the Good Samaritan to, really illustrate what it means to love your neighbor. But there's another layer to this story I think we haven't touched on yet. It's the Samaritan himself.
Oh, I see what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Here's this guy, right? He's supposed to be the enemy, the outsider. And yet he's the one showing true compassion, embodying God's love in such a practical way.
Exactly. It's like Jesus flipped the script, showing us that love transcends those cultural boundaries and expectations. It makes you wonder if sometimes the people we least expect are the ones closest to God's heart.
That's a really interesting thought. And it reminds us that God's kingdom is, well, it's radically inclusive. It welcomes those who are often pushed aside. The Samaritan becomes almost like a picture of Jesus himself, seeking and saving those the world has labeled as lost.
It really challenges us to check our own prejudices, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To really examine who we consider to be our neighbor. Mm-hmm. But there's another aspect to these two greatest commandments we haven't talked about much. Obedience.
Obedience is a word that can feel, loaded for some people. Like it's about being forced to do things we don't want to do. But in the context of God's love, obedience takes on a whole new meaning.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not about following rules out of fear.
Right.
It's about responding to God's love because we want to please him. Like when you truly love someone, you want to do things that make them happy.
Right. That's such a great analogy. It makes obedience feel less like a burden and more like, well, a natural expression of our love for God.
Yeah, I think so. And this kind of brings up another interesting concept. Freedom. Some people think that following God's commandments limits our freedom. But I actually think the opposite is true.
That's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? True freedom is actually found in surrendering to God's will. Think about it like this. Imagine a fish trying to live on land. It's out of its element, struggling to survive.
Yeah.
But in the water, it's free to move and thrive.
So you're saying when we try to live apart from God, we're like that fish out of water.
Yeah.
Always striving, but never truly satisfied.
Exactly. But when we surrender to God's love and we embrace his commandments, we discover true freedom. We're no longer bound by our own, selfish desires. We're free to experience that abundant life that Jesus promised.
We're free to become the people God created us to be. And the beautiful thing is, it's never too late to start this journey.
I love that. It's so true. No matter what mistakes you've made, God's love is always available. He's always inviting us to come back to him, surrender our hearts, and let him transform us.
And when we do that, I think we find ourselves naturally drawn to those acts of love and justice.
It's like an overflow of God's grace working in our hearts. This isn't just about, acquiring knowledge.
Right.
It's about being changed from the inside out, becoming more and more like Jesus.
That's what makes this so exciting.
Yeah.
It's about living a life of purpose and meaning, a life that reflects God's love and grace to the world around us.
And the best part is we're not alone in this journey. God is with us every step of the way, empowering us, guiding us, and loving us unconditionally.
And that's a truth worth sharing with everyone we meet.
It certainly is. There's still so much to unpack, though. Join us for part 3, where we'll explore how we can put these principles into action and become, agents of change in the world.
We've been talking about, the depth and the richness of the 2 greatest commandments, loving God and loving our neighbor.
Right.
But something that comes up a lot, I think, is how to live these out, especially when it comes to social justice.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's easy to feel overwhelmed, by the sheer amount of need in the world. Like, where do we even begin?
Right. You see so much suffering and injustice, it's almost paralyzing. But I keep coming back to this idea. It all starts with love. Love for God and love for our neighbor.
Yeah.
That's the foundation. And if we get those 2 things right, everything else kind of flows from that.
For sure. It's not about having a perfect plan or knowing all the answers. It's about opening our hearts to God's love and letting it guide our actions.
Exactly. It's like what we see in the story of the Good Samaritan.
Right.
He didn't have some grand agenda. He simply saw a person in need and responded with compassion.
Absolutely.
It makes me think we need to be more aware of the needs around us.
Yeah.
In our communities, workplaces, families. Where can we be instruments of God's love?
There are so many ways to make a difference, big and small. Offering a listening ear to someone who's struggling, volunteering at a local charity, donating to a cause you believe in, even just advocating for someone who feels voiceless. The point is, what matters most is that we're motivated by love.
Right.
That we're trying to reflect God's heart in everything we do.
I think it's important to remember, too, that loving our neighbor doesn't always mean agreeing with them.
Oh, that's so important.
We can still treat people with dignity and respect, even when we have those differences of opinion.
Right. We can try to understand where they're coming from, even if we don't agree.
Yeah.
And, we can offer grace and forgiveness, which, it can be hard sometimes.
It could be so hard.
But that's exactly what God has done for us, right?
Yeah.
Loved us even when we were messing up. Offered grace when we didn't deserve it. We're called to do the same for others.
It's a reflection of that, radical, unconditional love that God has shown us.
It really is. And when we truly grasp that kind of love, loving our neighbor becomes less of a duty and more of a privilege. We become part of God's work in the world, bringing hope and healing to those around us.
And that's what it's all about, isn't it? Glorifying God by showing the world who he is and what he's all about.
Yeah.
It's about living a life that honors our Creator, a life that reflects his love to everyone we meet.
A life that truly embodies these 2 greatest commandments.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope you feel encouraged and empowered to go and make a difference.
Me too.
Let's commit to loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And let's love our neighbors as ourselves.
And may God bless you as you put these principles into action, bringing his light and love to the world.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this exploration of God's Word has resonated with you and will continue to guide your steps.
Until next time, may you be filled with the love and peace of Christ.